The sun hung low over Red Hollow, Wyoming, painting the dusty frontier town in shades of gold and amber. In the late 1880s, life on the open plains was never easy. Every family fought against drought, hunger, harsh winters, and the endless challenge of surviving another season. For Abigail Monroe, the struggle was more personal. She was fighting to save the only thing her parents had left behind. At 28 years old, Abby was known as one of the kindest women in town. She had long blonde hair, gentle eyes, and a quiet strength that appeared even when life pushed her to the edge. She lived alone on her family's small farm, wearing simple prairie dresses and spending every day working the land her parents had loved. But Abby was never truly alone. Beside her was Buddy, her loyal golden-brown shepherd mix who had been with her since he was a tiny puppy. He had followed her through every hardship, from the day she buried her parents to every lonely night spent keeping the old farmhouse alive. To Abby, Buddy was not just a dog. He was family. For years, Abby managed to keep the farm running. She planted crops, repaired fences, and worked from sunrise until sunset. But the land was becoming harder to survive. A terrible drought ruined harvest after harvest, and debts began piling up. The local lender, a wealthy businessman named Harold Whitaker, saw Abby's struggles as an opportunity. "Your farm is worth more than you can afford to keep," Harold told her one afternoon. "Sell it now, and you might walk away with something." Abby stood firmly in front of her farmhouse, refusing to let him take away her family's memory. "This land belonged to my parents," she replied. "I will not give it up without a fight." But courage could not always defeat reality. As winter approached, Abby had fewer supplies, less money, and almost nothing left to sell. She skipped meals so Buddy could eat. She repaired her old coat instead of buying a new one. Every day became a battle. The hardest moment came when Abby noticed Buddy growing weaker. The once energetic dog struggled to run across the fields and rested more often by the fireplace. That night, Abby sat beside him with tears in her eyes. "You deserve better than this," she whispered. The next morning, Abby made a decision that broke her heart. She found a family in town who could provide Buddy with food and shelter. She told herself it would only be temporary. She promised Buddy she would come back for him when she had rebuilt her life. As Buddy looked back at her from the wagon, Abby felt as if she was losing the last piece of her old world. Miles away from Abby's farm lived Nathaniel Nate Walker, a 38-year-old cowboy who owned a quiet ranch beyond the hills. Nate was respected throughout the region for his honesty and hard work. However, behind his calm expression was a man carrying years of loneliness. After losing his wife, Nate had devoted himself entirely to his ranch. He believed his heart had already experienced its greatest happiness and that those days were gone forever. One cold evening, while checking the edge of his property, Nate found a tired dog lying near a fence post. The animal looked exhausted but still lifted its head when Nate approached. "Easy, boy," Nate said softly. He carried the dog back to his ranch, gave him food, water, and a warm place to sleep. Over the next few days, Buddy slowly recovered. Nate noticed the dog's intelligence and loyalty. There was something special about him. Then Nate discovered the name on the collar. Abigail Monroe. He realized this dog belonged to someone who was probably searching for him. The next morning, Nate prepared his horse and decided to return Buddy to his owner. He thought he was simply bringing back a lost dog. He had no idea that this journey would change 3 lives forever. When Nate arrived in Red Hollow, he expected a simple reunion. Instead, he would discover a woman whose courage matched his and a future neither imagined. Nate Walker had spent years believing that life was meant to be lived quietly. His ranch, his horses, and his endless work were enough to fill his days. He had stopped expecting happiness to return after losing his wife, and he had convinced himself that loneliness was simply the price of surviving. But everything changed the morning he rode into Red Hollow with Buddy beside him. The moment Abby Monroe saw the golden-brown shepherd mix standing next to Nate, she froze. For a second, she could not believe what she was seeing. "Buddy." The dog immediately recognized her voice. He pulled away from Nate and ran across the street, moving faster than he had in weeks. Abby dropped to her knees as Buddy reached her, wrapping her arms around him while tears streamed down her face. "Oh, Buddy. I thought I lost you forever." The dog rested his head against her shoulder, as if he was telling her he had never forgotten her. People nearby stopped to watch the emotional reunion. They knew how much Buddy meant to Abby. They had seen her walk through town with him every day before hardship forced them apart. Nate stood quietly, watching the moment unfold. He had found a lost dog, but now he understood he had returned something far more valuable. He had given a woman back the one piece of her life she thought was gone forever. After Abby finally calmed down, she turned toward Nate. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You have no idea what this means to me." Nate gave a small smile. "I think I do. That dog looked like he belonged with you." Abby looked down, holding Buddy's collar. She wanted to tell Nate everything: the farm, the debt, the fear of losing her home, and the painful choice she had made. But she was embarrassed. She did not want anyone to see how desperate her situation had become. Nate noticed anyway. He saw the tiredness in her eyes. He saw the worn fabric of her dress and the way she avoided talking about where she was living. He had spent years reading the land and understanding silent struggles. "Miss Monroe," Nate said, "do you have a place to stay?" Abby hesitated. "I'll manage." Nate looked toward the empty road leading outside town. That's what people say when they're trying to convince themselves they're all right. His words were not judgmental. They were gentle. Abby lowered her eyes. "I lost my farm," she finally admitted. "The drought took almost everything. I gave Buddy away because I couldn't even afford to feed him properly." Nate looked at the dog sitting faithfully beside her. "You gave him up because you loved him." Those words touched Abby deeply. She had spent weeks feeling guilty, believing she had abandoned the one creature who trusted her most. Nate continued, "I could use some help at my ranch. The house has been empty for a long time, and I have more work than one person can handle." Abby quickly shook her head. "I couldn't accept charity." "It isn't charity," Nate replied. "It's work. You help me, and I pay you. Simple as that." Abby looked at Buddy, then back at Nate. She had learned not to trust easily, but something about this quiet cowboy felt different. He was not offering pity. He was offering dignity. After a long pause, she nodded. "I'll come." A few days later, Abby arrived at Walker Ranch with Buddy by her side. The moment she stepped onto the property, she noticed how quiet it was. The ranch was beautiful, with wide fields, strong wooden fences, and mountains in the distance. But something was missing. It felt empty. Nate had built a successful ranch, but he had never rebuilt a home. Abby slowly changed that. She planted flowers near the porch. She repaired old curtains. She cooked warm meals instead of Nate eating alone beside a cold fireplace. Little by little, the ranch began to feel alive again. Even Buddy seemed happier. He followed Nate while he worked with the horses and often rested near him in the evenings. At first, Nate was surprised by how quickly the dog accepted him. "You've got a way of making people trust you," Nate told Buddy one evening. The dog simply wagged his tail. Abby watched from the porch and smiled. "He knows a good heart when he sees one." Nate looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment. He was not used to anyone seeing past the quiet exterior he had built around himself. As the weeks passed, Abby and Nate became closer. They shared stories while repairing fences. They watched sunsets over the fields. They laughed during small moments they never expected to enjoy again. One evening, Nate finally opened up about his past. "My wife was a good woman," he said quietly. "After she was gone, I thought moving forward meant leaving that part of my life behind." Abby listened carefully. "You don't have to forget someone to keep living," she told him. "Love doesn't disappear. It just changes." For the first time in years, Nate felt peace. Abby had lost her home, but she had found a place where she belonged. Nate had lost his love, but he was beginning to believe his heart was not finished. However, their happiness did not go unnoticed. Back in Red Hollow, Harold Whitaker was not willing to let Abby escape his control. He had expected her to leave the area completely. Instead, she was rebuilding her life on a ranch that was becoming stronger every day. And now, he had a new plan. A plan that threatened everything Abby and Nate had worked so hard to build. The morning sun rose over Walker Ranch, spreading golden light across the open fields. For the first time in many years, Nathaniel Nate Walker looked around his property and felt something he thought he had lost forever. peace. The ranch was no longer just a place where he worked until exhaustion. It had become a home again. Abigail "Abby" Monroe had brought warmth into every corner of the property. The porch had flowers growing beside it, the kitchen carried the smell of fresh bread, and laughter had returned to rooms that had been silent for years. Even Buddy had changed. The once-lost shepherd mix had become the heart of the ranch. He followed Nate while he worked with the horses, stayed close to Abby during her chores, and seemed determined to keep both of them together. But beyond the peaceful hills, trouble was approaching. Harold Whitaker arrived in Red Hollow with papers in his hand and anger in his eyes. He had built his fortune by taking advantage of people who had no power to fight back. He believed Abby Monroe was another person who would eventually surrender. He had been wrong. When Harold arrived at Walker Ranch, Nate met him at the gate. "You're a long way from town," Nate said calmly. Harold stepped down from his horse. "I'm here about unfinished business." The Monroe property was never properly settled. According to these documents, there are claims that still need to be resolved. Abby, who had walked outside after hearing the conversation, immediately recognized the threat. "You already took enough from me," she said. Harold smiled. "I offered you a fair deal years ago." "No," Abby replied. "You offered me a chance to lose everything." Nate stepped forward, standing beside her. "She's not alone anymore." Those words surprised Abby. For years, she had fought every battle by herself. Now, someone was standing beside her, not because he felt sorry for her, but because he believed in her. Harold tried to intimidate them. "You think one cowboy can stop me?" Nate looked at him without fear. "I think the truth can." After Harold left, Abby worried. "This is because of me," she said quietly. "You had a peaceful life before I came here." Nate shook his head. "No, Abby. I had a quiet life. That's not the same thing." She looked at him. "What's the difference?" Nate glanced toward the ranch, then toward Buddy resting near the porch. "A quiet life means nobody is there to hurt you. A peaceful life means you have someone worth protecting." Abby felt the weight of his words. For the first time, she realized Nate was not protecting her because he felt responsible. He was protecting her because she mattered. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. Nate searched through old ranch records and traveled to speak with people who knew Abby's family. He discovered that Harold had taken advantage of several struggling families in the area, using confusing paperwork and unfair agreements to gain control of their land. The truth slowly came together. With the support of the townspeople, Nate and Abby presented the evidence. The people of Red Hollow remembered Abby's kindness and Nate's honesty. They stood beside them, refusing to let another innocent family lose their home. Harold's scheme was finally exposed. The documents he used against Abby were proven dishonest, and his claim against the ranch disappeared. The man who had spent years taking from others was finally forced to answer for his actions. For Abby, it was more than winning a legal battle. It was freedom. She returned to Walker Ranch knowing she no longer had to run from her past. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Abby sat beside Nate on the porch. Buddy rested peacefully at their feet. "It's strange," Abby said softly. "I thought losing my farm was the end of my life." Nate looked at her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I think it was the beginning of something I never expected." Nate reached for her hand. "When I found Buddy wandering near my ranch, I thought I was saving a lost dog." He looked down at the loyal companion beside them. "But he was actually leading me to the person who would save me." Abby's eyes filled with emotion. Nate had spent years believing his heart was closed forever. But Abby had shown him that love did not have to replace the past. It could honor it while creating something new. Months later, the Walker Ranch was filled with celebration. Abby and Nate were married, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and the people who had watched their journey from the beginning. Buddy sat proudly beside them, wearing a small collar decorated for the occasion. The dog who had once been lost had brought two lonely souls together. Years later, people in Red Hollow would still tell the story of the woman who gave up her beloved dog because she loved him enough to let him go, and the cowboy who returned him only to give them both a second chance. Because on the wild frontier, where life was often harsh and uncertain, Abby and Nate discovered something greater than survival. They discovered home. And sometimes, the greatest blessings arrive in the form of something, or someone, you thought you had lost forever.